Have you ever looked at your own blood and realized you are just a pawn for 32 years? I was a ghost in my family. They took the empire and tossed me a broken watch as a final insult. They thought they had stripped me of everything. But the game flipped the day a four-star general knocked on my door. That dead watch was actually the detonator that would blow their empire of lies to ashes. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us now. Let's begin the story. My name is Bella Mason. I am 32 years old, a former cybersecurity officer for the United States Air Force, and currently a struggling freelance coder who can barely afford black coffee in the morning. The law office of Sterling and Vance sat on the 45th floor of a gleaming glass tower in downtown Austin, Texas. The room smelled of old money, polished mahogany, and the distinct, metallic scent of unbridled greed. Rain lashed heavily against the floor-to-ceiling windows, blurring the sprawling gray city skyline. But inside, the climate control was set to a perfectly sterile 68 degrees. I stood quietly near the back of the room, my worn leather boots sinking into a thick Persian rug that probably cost more than my entire year of rent. I did not belong here. I had known that for a very long time. Across the massive oak conference table sat my older sister, Vivian, and my younger brother, Julian. They looked like they had just stepped out of a magazine editorial on ruthless corporate royalty. Vivian, a supposedly avant-garde fashion designer whose only real talent was spending our father's money, was draped in black silk. She wore diamond earrings that caught the overhead light every time she shifted impatiently in her seat. Julian, the slick and overly manicured chief executive officer of himself, adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit. His solid gold watch gleamed on his wrist, a loud declaration of his status. They were practically vibrating with anticipation. Our father was dead, and the vultures had finally come to feast. The lawyer, a balding man with wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat and adjusted his silk tie. He had been reading for what felt like 2 agonizing hours, dissecting a man's entire life into percentages, corporate shares, and real estate portfolios. And now, regarding the controlling interest of Aegis Horizon Systems, the lawyer announced, his voice echoing in the large room. The space suddenly went completely still. Aegis Horizon Systems, the crown jewel, our father's fictionalized, yet painfully real, multi-billion-dollar defense technology corporation. To my daughter, Vivian Mason, and my son, Julian Mason, I leave my entire stake in Aegis Horizon Systems, to be divided evenly, 50-50. You shall assume full control of the board and all associated assets, effective immediately. Vivian let out a sharp, breathless exhale, her lips curling into a triumphant, red-painted smile. Julian leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. He did not even try to hide his smug satisfaction. They had won. They had spent their entire lives bowing, scraping, and flattering a cold, distant man. And today they received their massive ultimate paycheck. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no envy, just a hollow, tired weight in my chest. I had walked away from my father's empire at 18 to join the military. I chose a uniform and a cyber warfare terminal over corporate galas and empty pleasantries. I knew I was cut out of the main will years ago. The lawyer shuffled his heavy parchment papers, his eyes darting toward me with a flicker of genuine pity. I hated that look. Finally, to my youngest daughter, Bella Mason, the lawyer read, his voice dropping a fraction of a decibel. I leave the item contained within the wooden lockbox currently in my possession. May it remind her of the path she chose. The lawyer reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a small, battered, wooden box. He slid it across the polished oak table. It stopped right in front of me. Julian let out a short, biting laugh. Go on, Bella. Open your grand prize. Do not keep the suspense waiting. I ignored him. My fingers tracing the scratched surface of the wood, I flipped the brass latch and opened the lid. Resting on a bed of faded velvet was an old military-issue wristwatch. The leather strap was rotting and frayed. The glass face was severely cracked, spider-webbed entirely across the center. The metallic hands were frozen dead at 3:14. It was a piece of junk, but I knew this watch. It had belonged to our grandfather, Elias Mason. Vivian leaned forward, squinting at the box before bursting into a high-pitched, theatrical giggle. "Oh, that is just too perfect. A broken, useless piece of trash for the sister who threw away a fortune to play soldier in the dirt." "Honestly, it suits you, Bella," Julian chimed in, adjusting his tailored lapels with a sneer. "You wasted your best years hacking computers for the government on a meager salary instead of learning how the real world works. Father always said you were a lost cause. I guess this is his final way of saying he was right. Enjoy your antique." I looked at the cracked glass of the watch. I thought about the days I spent in windowless bunkers, protecting the digital infrastructure of a nation, while they attended yacht parties. I thought about the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of the people I shared blood with. They expected me to scream. They wanted me to throw a tantrum, to beg for a crumb of the Aegis Horizon pie. They fed on that kind of drama. Instead, I snapped the wooden box shut. The sharp click echoed loudly in the quiet room. "Keep the money, Julian. Keep the company. Vivian," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. "You are going to need it much more than I will." I did not wait for their response. I picked up the small box, turned on my heel, and walked out of the glass-paneled doors. I stepped into the elevator and rode it down 45 floors in absolute silence. When I pushed through the revolving doors of the lobby, the Texas sky broke open. A torrential downpour washed over the gray concrete of Austin. The cold rain soaked through my thin jacket instantly, but I did not run for cover. I walked steadily down the pavement, holding the wooden box tightly in my jacket pocket. The heavy raindrops felt like ice against my skin, but I welcomed the sting. It washed away the suffocating scent of leather and expensive cologne that clung to me from the office. For 32 years, I had been an invisible ghost in my own family, a quiet disappointment in the corner of every family photograph. They thought they had stripped me of everything. They thought they had handed me a final, pathetic insult. But as I clutched the broken watch of Elias Mason in my freezing hand, I felt a strange sense of peace. I was finally cut off from the toxic Mason name forever, or so I thought. 3 days dragged by in an agonizing crawl. The torrential rain that had soaked my jacket outside the opulent law office had finally surrendered to a suffocating, humid Texas heat. My apartment, located on the forgotten industrial outskirts of the city, felt like a concrete oven. It was a cramped space, barely 500 square feet of exposed plumbing, peeling lead paint, and the relentless, rattling hum of a cheap window air conditioning unit fighting a losing battle. The wooden box sat dead center on my chipped kitchen counter. I had not moved it. I had spent the last 72 hours alternating between pounding out low-level encryption code for a freelance client and staring intensely at the rusted piece of junk my grandfather had supposedly left me. The frayed leather strap smelled faintly of mildew and old sweat. The spider-webbed glass face mocked me with every passing hour. My father's final, calculated insult rested right there in my sanctuary, a rotting anchor tying me to a past I had desperately tried to sever. I reached out, my fingertips brushing the cold, oxidized steel of the casing. Then, the sound hit the door. 3 sharp, heavy raps, a calculated pause of exactly 2 seconds, 2 more raps. My hand flinched away from the watch. That was not the chaotic pounding of my landlord demanding the overdue rent, nor the hesitant, shuffling knock of a late-night food delivery driver. That precise, commanding rhythm was hammered into my brain during my early years of basic training. It was a standard military breach cadence. I slid silently toward the door, my bare feet making no sound against the scuffed linoleum floor. I pressed my eye to the scratched peephole. My breath caught sharply in my throat, freezing my lungs. Standing in the dimly lit, narrow hallway of my rundown building was a man who looked like he could command the very air around him to stand still. He wore a pristine United States Air Force dress uniform. The crisp, immaculate blue fabric stood in stark defiance of the grime and decay on my apartment walls. Pinned to his broad shoulders were 4 heavy gleaming silver stars, a full-ranking, active-duty 4-star general. I recognized his stern, weathered face instantly from highly classified security briefings during my service years. General Arthur Sterling. Behind him, holding the perimeter on the crumbling concrete stairs, stood 2 men in tailored black suits. Their posture was rigid, their hands resting subtly near their waistbands, their eyes scanning the stairwell with predatory, mechanical focus. Federal agents. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open. General Sterling did not smile. He did not offer a polite greeting, nor did he apologize for the unannounced intrusion into a civilian residence. His slate-gray eyes bypassed me entirely, cutting straight through the dim, flickering lighting of my apartment to lock directly onto the kitchen counter. He zeroed in on the rusted watch as if it were a high-value target. He stepped over the threshold, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the linoleum. He dwarfed the small room, bringing with him the suffocating, electrified tension of an underground war room mere minutes before a strike order. I closed the door behind him, my defensive instincts flaring wildly in my chest. "General Sterling," I said, keeping my voice incredibly level and my posture perfectly straight. "I am no longer active duty. What is a 4-star commander doing in my kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon?" He ignored my question completely. He stopped mere inches from the counter, his imposing figure casting a long shadow over the wooden box. His gaze remained fixated on the cracked glass of the timepiece. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until he finally turned his head slowly to look at me. "Have you opened the back of it yet?" he asked. His voice was a low, commanding rumble that seemed to vibrate the floorboards. The bizarre question hit me like a physical blow. I stared at him, my analytical mind racing through a dozen tactical scenarios, trying to parse the sheer absurdity of the situation. "Open the back," I echoed, my brow furrowing in deep confusion. "It is a dead military-issue watch. The casing is completely sealed shut with decades of rust. It has been broken since before I was born." "Nothing your grandfather ever built was broken, Bella," Sterling replied, his tone chillingly absolute. "He did not leave you a simple timepiece. He left you a vault. Open it." My heart began to hammer violently against my ribs. The air in the room suddenly felt dangerously thin, charged with a heavy metallic static. I moved swiftly to my work desk, my hands moving purely on trained muscle memory, and retrieved a slender, surgical-grade titanium scalpel from my hardware repair kit. I returned to the counter and picked up the heavy, rusted watch, feeling the weight of the general's scrutiny burning into my skin. "There is a microscopic pressure pin concealed right below the winding crown," General Sterling instructed, stepping closer, his eyes tracking my every agonizingly slow movement. "Find the groove, insert the blade exactly 2 millimeters deep, apply firm upward leverage." I held my breath. I angled the watch under the harsh, flickering fluorescent light of the kitchen hood. My trained eyes caught it, a hairline fracture in the oxidized metal that anyone else would have dismissed as standard structural damage. I wedged the razor-sharp tip of the scalpel into the microscopic gap. I pressed down, feeling the rigid, stubborn resistance of the metal. I applied calculated force. A sharp metallic click echoed through the quiet apartment. It sounded exactly like the pulling of a grenade pin. The solid steel backplate of the watch sprang upward on a hidden hinge. I carefully lifted the heavy metal disc away. What lay inside made the blood turn to absolute ice in my veins. There were no gears. There were no winding springs, no delicate cogs, no rusted mechanics. The entire internal cavity of the watch had been hollowed out and flawlessly machined with microscopic precision. Resting snugly inside a custom-fitted, shock-absorbent cradle was a sleek, rectangular sliver of brushed titanium. It was a high-capacity quantum storage drive. I picked it up with a pair of fine tweezers, my hands trembling ever so slightly. Along the spine of the microdrive, a complex alphanumeric code was laser-etched deeply into the metal. I had spent years immersed in the darkest corners of cyber warfare. I knew weapons-grade encryption protocols when I saw them. "What exactly is this?" I whispered, my eyes entirely unable to tear away from the tiny piece of metal that suddenly felt much heavier than a loaded gun. "Your grandfather, Elias Mason, was never just a frontline infantryman," General Sterling said, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper. "That was his government-mandated cover. He was the chief cryptologic architect for a Black Book defense initiative during the height of the Cold War. He was a visionary genius who saw the digital battlefield decades before the rest of the world even knew what a microchip was." The general pointed a heavy gloved finger directly at the drive clamped in my tweezers. "That titanium drive contains the Aegis core," he continued, every single word landing like a hammer strike against an anvil. "It is the original, foundational source code and the master patent for the entire quantum radar grid, the exact same operational grid that Aegis Horizon Systems currently sells for billions to the Department of Defense. Your father did not invent it. He never possessed the intellect to even comprehend the mathematics behind it. He merely held a temporary licensing agreement to commercialize Elias's classified work." I slowly looked up from the drive, meeting the general's intense, unblinking gaze as the devastating reality began to forcefully slot into place. The sneers of my sister, the smug laughter of my brother, the grand inheritance they had just paraded in front of me. It was all built on a monumental lie. "This watch," Sterling said, his eyes narrowing into cold, calculating slits, "is the only key in existence. Vivian and Julian think they just inherited a global superpower, but the truth is, you hold the detonator to their entire empire." The heavily armored black sport utility vehicle tore across the desolate stretches of the Texas highway, leaving the suffocating heat of the city far behind. We drove in absolute, heavy silence for nearly 2 hours. General Sterling sat across from me, a stoic statue carved from granite, while the 2 federal agents guarded the front. My mind was a chaotic storm of fragmented codes and shattered realities. We arrived at a classified subterranean facility buried deep beneath the limestone hills, somewhere outside of San Antonio. We passed through 4 separate biometric checkpoints, descending deep into the belly of the earth via a high-speed freight elevator. The air down here tasted sterile, laced with the metallic tang of ozone and heavily filtered oxygen. General Sterling escorted me into a stark, windowless room dominated by a single massive air-gapped computer terminal. There was no connection to the outside world, no wireless signals, total isolation. "The terminal is yours," Sterling commanded, gesturing to the sleek mechanical keyboard. "Insert the drive." My hands felt unusually heavy as I slid the microscopic titanium sliver into the specialized quantum reader on the console. The massive monitors flared to life instantly, casting a harsh, pale blue glow across the dark room. A biometric prompt flashed on the screen, demanding a retinal scan and a voice print verification. My grandfather had prepared this specifically for me, weaving my unique physical signature into the deepest layers of the military encryption. Once the security protocols accepted my credentials, a cascade of heavily classified documents flooded the displays. My eyes, trained to decipher complex data streams, scanned the legal jargon and architectural blueprints at lightning speed. The truth hit me with the devastating force of a freight train. My father had been a magnificent, unparalleled fraud. The documents clearly proved that Elias Mason was the sole architect of the quantum radar grid. My grandfather retained 100% of the patents, the source code, and the intellectual property rights. My father, the supposedly brilliant pioneer of modern defense technology, had merely negotiated a long-term licensing contract with his own father to commercialize the algorithm. He had built his entire multi-billion-dollar empire on rented ground. He had lied to his investors, to the board of directors, to the global markets, and most of all, to his own family. I pulled up the master licensing agreement. My eyes locked onto the termination clause. The contract between Elias Mason and Aegis Horizon Systems was strictly bound to my father's lifespan, with a brief grace period for transitional administration. The license was scheduled to officially expire in exactly 48 hours. Without the quantum core algorithm, Aegis Horizon Systems was nothing but a hollow shell. Their radar systems would go blind. Their massive defense contracts would be instantly voided. The company my siblings had just viciously celebrated inheriting would legally disintegrate into absolute worthlessness in 2 days unless the new rightful owner of the patent signed a renewal. And according to the irrefutable, digitally notarized will embedded in the drive, the sole inheritor of the Aegis core was me. Before I could fully process the monumental scale of this deception, the screen flickered. The legal documents faded, replaced by a high-definition video file. My breath hitched. There, sitting in a dimly lit study, was my grandfather, Elias. He looked older than I remembered, his face lined with the heavy burden of a man who had seen too many wars, but his eyes were piercing, sharp, and intensely alive. "Hello, Bella," his rough, gravelly voice echoed through the sterile room, sending a violent shiver down my spine. "If you are watching this, it means my son has passed, and you have finally opened the watch. I know the life you chose. I know the hardships you endured while your siblings drowned in luxury. You thought I abandoned you to that fate. I did not. I was observing." He leaned closer to the camera, his expression softening into a look of profound, aching pride. "Power is a terrifying poison. My dear, I watched it rot your father from the inside out. I watched it turn Vivian and Julian into hollow, ruthless creatures driven solely by greed. I could not give them the core. They would sell it to the highest bidder, plunging this nation into darkness for a thicker profit margin. I needed someone who understood duty, someone who understood sacrifice. I chose you, Bella, because you are the only one in our bloodline who possesses the heart of a sentinel. You have the soul of a watchman. You stood on the digital walls and protected people who will never even know your name. You were not blinded by the gold." A single hot tear traced its way down my cheek. For 32 years, I thought I was the outcast, the failure, the forgotten mistake of the Mason dynasty. I thought I meant absolutely zero. But in the shadows, I was the only one who had truly mattered to the architect of our legacy. "The fate of Aegis Horizon is now entirely in your hands," Elias continued, his tone turning deadly serious. "You have the power to save it, or the power to let it burn to the ground. Trust your instincts. Sentinel. End of transmission." The screen faded to black. The silence in the underground bunker was absolutely deafening. General Sterling stepped forward from the shadows, his hands clasped firmly behind his back. "Vivian and Julian are currently popping champagne in their penthouse," he noted quietly. "They believe they are invincible. They have no idea that the ground beneath their feet is rigged with high explosives, and you are holding the detonator." I stared at the black screen, my reflection staring back at me. A fierce, unfamiliar heat began to bloom in my chest. It was not the cheap, chaotic thrill of vindictiveness. It was something far heavier, far more dangerous. It was the terrifying, sobering weight of absolute power. I thought about Vivian's theatrical, mocking giggle. I thought about Julian's smug, punchable face as he told me I was a lost cause. They had spent their entire lives treating me like dirt beneath their bespoke shoes. They had publicly humiliated me, stripped me of my dignity, and cast me out into the rain with what they thought was a piece of garbage. Now, the universe had handed me the executioner's axe. In exactly 48 hours, I could watch them lose every single penny, every ounce of prestige, every shred of their arrogant identities. I could completely obliterate the people who had mercilessly trampled over me for decades. I reached out and pulled the titanium drive from the console, gripping it tightly in my fist until the sharp edges dug painfully into my palm. I turned to face the 4-star general, feeling the ghost of my grandfather standing right beside me. "General Sterling," I said, my voice hardening into solid steel, I need you to get me a suit. I have a board meeting to attend. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. By dawn the next morning, the financial world was violently shaking. I sat at my cramped kitchen counter, sipping black coffee, watching the morning market broadcasts on my battered laptop. The news anchors were speaking in frantic, breathless tones. A highly classified leak had somehow found its way to the top editors of the Wall Street Journal. The headline blazing across the bottom of the screen read, "Aegis Horizon Systems faces catastrophic intellectual property loss." The stock market reacted with the ruthless efficiency of a guillotine. Within the first 2 hours of trading, Aegis Horizon shares plummeted 22%. By noon, the drop reached a staggering 35%. Billions of dollars in corporate valuation were evaporating into thin air with every tick of the clock. Wall Street sharks smelled blood in the water. The rumors were vicious and precise, stating that the company did not actually own the proprietary quantum radar algorithms securing their massive federal defense contracts. My burner phone vibrated aggressively on the table, snapping me out of my thoughts. The caller identification displayed Julian's private number. I let it ring 4 times before sliding the accept button. "Bella, what in the name of God is going on?" Julian shouted, his voice cracking with a raw, unfiltered panic I had never heard from him before. The slick, arrogant chief executive officer from the lawyer's office was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified boy watching his sandcastle wash away. "Good afternoon, Julian," I replied, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. "How is the stock market treating you today?" "Did you do this?" he spat, his breathing heavy and erratic. "Did you leak this garbage to the press? The board is in an absolute frenzy. The Pentagon is calling my office every 15 minutes demanding clarification. You need to tell me what you found in that wooden box right now." "I found clarity," I said simply. "Listen to me, you ungrateful little brat," Julian snarled, attempting to regain his dominant posture. "I know Elias gave you something. I do not care what kind of game you think you are playing, but you are messing with the Mason family legacy. You are destroying our wealth. You will bring whatever codes or documents you have to my office immediately, or I will have our legal team bury you so deep in litigation you will not see daylight until you are 80 years old. Your legal team cannot save you from copyright expiration." "Julian," I stated, leaning back in my chair, "in exactly 24 hours, the license agreement holding your entire company together becomes null and void. I am the sole owner of the Aegis Core." There was a suffocating silence on the other end of the line. The realization was hitting him like a physical strike. "Bella, please." Julian's voice suddenly shifted, dropping into a sickeningly sweet, pleading tone that made my stomach turn. "We are family. We share the same blood. Do not do this. We can work this out. I will give you a seat on the board. I will give you 10% of the company, 20%. Just bring me the drive, for the sake of the family." "You never considered me family when you had the upper hand," I said, my tone absolute and final. "I will see you at the emergency board meeting." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the counter. I did not give him a chance to scream another word. 2 hours later, I stood outside the towering, glass and steel headquarters of Aegis Horizon Systems. The building was a monolith of corporate greed, a place where I was once treated like an embarrassing stain on the lobby floor. Today, I was dressed in a razor-sharp, charcoal gray tailored suit provided by General Sterling. I walked through the revolving doors, bypassing the frantic security guards who were too busy answering ringing phones to notice me. I took the executive elevator straight to the top floor. The doors slid open to reveal a scene of absolute chaos. Interns were sprinting down the hallways. Executives were shouting into headsets. I walked past them all, my footsteps echoing against the polished marble floor, and pushed open the heavy oak doors of the main boardroom. The room fell dead silent. 12 members of the board of directors sat around the massive mahogany table, their faces pale and slick with sweat. At the far end of the table stood Vivian and Julian. Vivian looked utterly deranged, her perfectly styled hair disheveled, her expensive black silk blouse wrinkled. Julian was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were entirely white. "Security!" Vivian shrieked the moment she saw me. "Get this pathetic failure out of my building." Nobody moved. The board members simply stared at me in stunned silence. I walked calmly toward the head of the table, the seat reserved for the chairman. I pulled the heavy leather chair back and sat down, crossing my legs and resting my hands on the polished wood. "I highly suggest you all take a seat," I commanded, my voice projecting clearly across the vast room. "We have a lot of business to discuss, and you are running out of time." Julian marched toward me, his face flushed a violent shade of purple. "You have no right to be here, Bella. You own 0 shares. You are trespassing." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of digitally verified, government-stamped legal documents. I tossed them onto the center of the table. They slid smoothly across the wood, stopping right in front of the chief financial officer. "Those documents prove that I am the sole, indisputable owner of the Aegis Corps," I announced, meeting the eyes of every single person in the room. "The quantum algorithm powering every single defense contract this company holds belongs entirely to me. My grandfather left it to me. Your licensing agreement expires tomorrow at noon. When it does, I am legally authorized to trigger a remote wipe that will shut down the entire Aegis radar grid globally with a single click." A collective gasp rippled through the boardroom. The chief financial officer rapidly flipped through the pages, his eyes widening in pure horror as he verified the government seals and the patent transfer clauses. He looked up at Julian, his face completely ashen, and gave a slow, devastating nod. It was real. Vivian collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her hands. Julian stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly, a defeated, broken man. The power dynamic in the room had completely inverted in less than 60 seconds. I held their financial lives in the palm of my hand, and they knew it. I looked around the room. I saw the fear in the eyes of the board members. I thought about the thousands of innocent engineers, technicians, and factory workers whose livelihoods depended on this company. They did not deserve to lose their homes and their savings just because my siblings were greedy monsters. I had come here to present a compromise, a strict restructuring deal that would strip Vivian and Julian of their power while keeping the company operational for the workers. "I am not here to destroy the innocent," I started, reaching for the company's latest quarterly financial report binder resting near the center of the table. "I am prepared to offer a conditional renewal of the patent, provided that massive leadership changes are implemented immediately." I opened the thick binder, intending to outline my terms, but as my eyes scanned the top page of the internal ledger, something entirely wrong caught my attention. My years as a cybersecurity auditor kicked in instantly. The numbers did not align. There was a massive, gaping hole in the research and development budget. Nearly $500 million had been quietly siphoned out of the operational funds over the last 6 months, routed through a complex web of offshore shell corporations. This was not just standard corporate embezzlement. The routing numbers pointed to a highly restricted international financial sector. I traced the origin of the offshore accounts, cross-referencing the data in my head. A cold, sharp realization pierced through my chest, freezing the air in my lungs. I looked up at Julian, who was suddenly avoiding my gaze, sweat pouring down his forehead. This was no longer just a family dispute over money. This was something far darker. I stared at the heavily redacted ledger pages, the numbers swimming before my eyes, until the underlying patterns snapped into brutal, undeniable focus. My fingers flew across the keyboard of my own secure terminal, which I had quietly linked to the boardroom's wireless network the moment I sat down. Julian was sloppy. His administrative access was wide open, practically begging for a brute force entry. I bypassed his secondary firewalls in less than 40 seconds, diving deep into the encrypted server partitions he thought were perfectly hidden from the world. Lines of code and routing numbers cascaded down my screen. The $500 million was not just missing due to standard corporate greed. It was a calculated deposit, a massive, untraceable down payment. I traced the digital fingerprints through a complex labyrinth of shell corporations stationed in the Cayman Islands, bouncing through proxy servers in Eastern Europe, before finally terminating at a holding company based in a sovereign territory notoriously hostile to the United States. It was a well-known, highly classified front for a foreign intelligence agency. The air in the room grew entirely stagnant. My father, for all his colossal flaws, his greed, and his emotional bankruptcy, was an American industrialist. He was a ruthless capitalist who worshipped money, but he was not a traitor. He had built his empire on defense contracts and patriotic posturing. The puzzle pieces violently collided in my mind, forming a horrifying picture. The sudden, unexplained change to the will, the secret meeting with the lawyer, the rusted watch left to the disgraced military daughter. My father had discovered their catastrophic treason right before his heart gave out. He realized his golden children, Vivian and Julian, were actively brokering a backdoor deal to sell the Aegis Core radar technology to an enemy state. He knew Vivian and Julian would simply take the blood money and vanish, leaving the national security grid completely blind and utterly vulnerable to a foreign strike. And he knew that of all the people in his miserable, fractured family, I was the only one who still understood the absolute meaning of an oath. He did not leave me the watch out of spite. He left it to me because I was the only soldier he had left to hold the line. He needed someone who could not be bought. I slowly closed the financial binder. The silence in the room was deafening. Every board member was staring at me, waiting for the executioner to drop the axe on the patent renewal. I did not look at them. I locked my eyes entirely on my younger brother. "You are not trying to save this company," I stated, my voice echoing like a gunshot in the tense silence. "You are liquidating it." Julian flinched, his perfectly manicured hands twitching against the mahogany table. "I have no idea what you're talking about. Bella, sign the transfer and get out." "A holding firm in Eastern Europe," I continued, projecting my voice so every single terrified executive could hear the undeniable truth. $500 million wired in 3 separate tranches over the last 72 hours. You and Vivian did not just embezzle corporate funds. You sold the backdoor access to the quantum radar grid to a foreign intelligence service. You committed high treason. The boardroom erupted into absolute chaos. The chief executive officer leaped from his chair, shouting frantic obscenities. 2 other directors scrambled backward, their chairs crashing heavily to the floor, instantly realizing they were sitting in a room with federal criminals. "Shut up!" Julian roared, his voice cracking with a terrifying, unhinged fury. He slammed his fist against the table, the facade of the polished, arrogant businessman shattered completely, revealing the desperate, ruthless cornered animal underneath. Vivian stood up, her face twisted into a grotesque mask of pure malice. "So what if we did?" Vivian sneered, crossing her arms defensively, showing zero remorse. "This entire company is a sinking ship. Father was a dinosaur, clinging to his pathetic defense contracts while the real money was waiting overseas. We secured our future. We were going to let the stock tank, take the cash, and disappear to a private island while you and these pathetic old men went down with the wreckage." "Father found out," I said, the truth finally spoken aloud. "That is why he gave me the watch. He knew you were selling out the country, and he knew my military clearance and my sense of duty would burn your illegal deal to the ground." "Well, Father is dead," Julian screamed, a wild, frantic light dancing in his eyes, "and his righteous little soldier is completely out of her depth." Julian reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy, matte black communication device. He pressed a single button. Before anyone could draw another breath, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom were violently kicked open. 6 heavily armed men wearing unmarked tactical gear stormed into the room. They were not standard corporate security. They moved with the cold, lethal precision of highly paid private mercenaries. They instantly fanned out, raising suppressed automatic weapons and aiming them directly at the screaming board of directors. "Nobody moves," the lead mercenary barked, securing the exits and locking the heavy deadbolts. The electronic blinds on the glass walls slammed shut automatically, plunging the room into artificial darkness, illuminated only by the harsh overhead fluorescent lights. The board members dropped to the floor, sobbing and begging for their lives. I remained seated in the chairman's chair, my muscles coiled tight, my eyes rapidly assessing the tactical layout of the room. 6 hostile targets, heavy weaponry, no immediate physical escape route. Julian walked slowly around the table, flanked by 2 of the armed guards. He stopped right beside my chair, a sick, victorious smile stretching across his pale face. "This is how the real world works, Bella," Julian whispered, leaning in close enough for me to smell the stale coffee and pure adrenaline on his breath. "Honor is a fairy tale for poor people. I have a buyer waiting for the master decryption key to the Aegis core right now. You are going to log into my terminal, input the proprietary code you found in that watch, and transfer full ownership directly to my offshore server." "And if I refuse?" I asked, my voice remaining unnervingly steady despite the rifles pointed at my chest. Julian gestured to the terrified chief financial officer weeping on the floor. "Then my men will start putting bullets into the heads of every single executive in this room, one by one, until you change your mind. And then, I will simply take the drive from your lifeless body and hire a black market cryptographer to crack it. The choice is yours. Sister, blood on your hands, or a signature on a screen." He was completely unhinged. The brother I grew up with was gone, replaced by a monster willing to massacre innocent people for a payout. I looked at the weeping men and women on the floor. I looked at Vivian, who was watching the scene with cold, detached amusement. And then I looked at the sleek laptop sitting open on Julian's side of the table. "Fine," I breathed heavily, allowing my shoulders to slump in an exaggerated display of absolute defeat. I let the panic bleed into my eyes, playing the role of the broken, cornered sibling perfectly. "You win, Julian. Just do not hurt anyone." "Good girl," Julian mocked, stepping aside and pointing his weapon toward the keyboard. "Type it in, now." I stood up slowly, keeping my hands clearly visible in the air. I walked over to his terminal. The transfer protocol screen was already active, waiting for the master administrator override password. 2 mercenaries stepped up right behind me, the cold steel muzzles of their rifles pressing hard against my spine. I placed my fingers on the keyboard. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, recalling the exact alphanumeric sequence laser-etched onto the titanium quantum drive. But I was not typing the transfer code. During my years in the Cyber Warfare Division, I had personally engineered a ghost protocol for high-risk hostage situations. It was a deeply buried subroutine, a silent distress signal masked as a standard cryptographic error. I typed a sequence of 32 highly specific keystrokes. It was not a password. It was a direct, encrypted military beacon. With my final keystroke, I hit the Enter key. The screen flashed red for a single millisecond before returning to the standard login prompt. Julian leaned over my shoulder, his brow furrowing in intense irritation. "What did you just do?" he demanded, shoving me hard against the edge of the table. The system rejected it. Type the real code. I did type a code. "Julian," I said, turning to face him. The mask of defeat vanished from my face entirely, replaced by a cold, predatory calm. But it was not for the server. I had just broadcasted the exact global positioning coordinates of this boardroom, along with a top-tier national security threat level, directly to the encrypted mobile uplink of General Arthur Sterling. The trap was permanently set. Now, we just had to wait for the hammer to fall. Julian stared at the screen, a vein throbbing violently in his forehead. He raised his hand to strike me, his mouth twisting into a furious snarl. "You think you are clever, I will kill you myself." He never finished the sentence. A deafening crash shattered the reinforced glass of the exterior windows. 3 concussive flashbang grenades detonated simultaneously, filling the expansive boardroom with blinding white light and a sound that rattled my teeth. Before the private mercenaries could even raise their weapons, the heavy oak doors were blown entirely off their hinges. Dozens of heavily armored federal tactical agents flooded the room like a dark, unstoppable tide. Laser sights cut through the smoke, pinning every single mercenary to the floor. The chaotic screams of my brother and sister were instantly drowned out by the harsh, booming commands of the strike team. Weapons down, get on the ground. The hostile takeover was dismantled in less than 30 seconds. As the smoke cleared, I watched 2 agents force Julian to his knees, zip-tying his hands roughly behind his back. Vivian was dragged out from under the table, her designer silk blouse torn, her face smeared with mascara and absolute terror. They were paraded out of the boardroom in front of the very executives they had threatened to execute, weeping and screaming threats that no one cared to hear. The golden children of the Mason Empire were finally exposed for exactly what they were. The following weeks were a grueling storm of federal investigations, board purges, and media frenzies. The government froze all of Vivian and Julian's assets. The treason charges guaranteed they would not see the outside of a cell for the rest of their natural lives. The media expected me to liquidate the tainted company and walk away with billions. That would have been the easy choice. It would have been the ultimate, scorched earth revenge against the family that had treated me like dirt. Instead, I chose to stay. I sat down in the chairman's office, signed the patent renewal, and initiated a massive corporate restructuring. I purged the corrupt board members and installed veterans and ethical engineers in their place. Aegis Horizon Systems transformed from a shadow-filled entity of corporate greed into a fully transparent defense contractor. We secured the quantum grid, but more importantly, we protected the livelihoods of the thousands of innocent employees who had simply been trying to feed their families. Exactly 1 year later, I walked down the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridor of a maximum security federal penitentiary. I sat down in a cold metal chair, separated from my younger brother by a thick pane of bulletproof glass. Julian looked hollow. His tailored suits were replaced by a faded orange jumpsuit. His slick hair was shaved down, and the arrogant fire in his eyes had completely burned out, leaving only a dull, empty stare. He picked up the plastic telephone receiver slowly. "Did you come here to gloat?" he asked, his voice raspy and weak. "No," I replied softly, my tone completely devoid of malice. "I came to drop something off." I slid a worn, leather-bound book through the small security slot at the bottom of the glass. It was a classic novel on military strategy, our father's favorite book from his study. Julian stared at it, his hands trembling slightly. "I do not hate you, Julian," I told him, looking directly into his tired eyes. "I just refuse to let you destroy innocent people to feed your ego. I chose justice. I leave the petty revenge to you." I hung up the receiver and walked away without looking back, leaving him entirely alone with his choices. Later that afternoon, the autumn breeze swept gently across the manicured green lawns of the National Military Memorial in Washington. I stood shoulder to shoulder with General Arthur Sterling, looking up at the towering marble monuments dedicated to those who had held the line in the darkest of times. I reached down and touched my left wrist. Strapped there was my grandfather's watch. I had taken it to a master horologist, who carefully cleaned the internal casing and reassembled the mechanical gears around the titanium drive. The shattered glass face remained exactly as it was, a beautiful, jagged scar. It was no longer a dead piece of junk. It was ticking perfectly, counting every single second with a steady, reassuring heartbeat. I looked at the cracked glass, feeling the profound weight of my grandfather's choice. He knew exactly what he was doing when he left me this burden. I finally understood his final lesson. True strength is never measured by how completely you can annihilate the people who hurt you. The most absolute, terrifying power in the world means nothing if you only use it to break things. True power is found in what you choose to protect, when you finally have the ability to destroy it all. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, Your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Maya Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.